Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Hyman. We are excited to have you join us today. It looks like a number of people are still joining for the presentation, so we'll give it another minute and then we'll get going. Thank you again for giving us your lunch hour to learn about this topic. All right, so as we've hit noon, I think we are going to dive in because we have a lot of material to uncover today. Again, my name is Heather Hyman, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today for an introduction to the intersecting worlds of human trafficking and immigration. This webinar is part of a regular series that's hosted by Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, which is the largest statewide pro bono service provider connecting low-income Marylanders with free civil legal services. And this presentation, as many of you know, is an effort of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which is a partnership between University of Baltimore School of Law and MVLS. It offers representation to trafficking survivors who are looking for help with criminal record relief, specifically through expungement, vacatur, and shielding. And we also connect clients with access to free civil legal services to address family law, housing, consumer debt, and other legal matters. And today, as noted, I am very excited to be able to welcome a former colleague, Deepa Bijpuria, who is the supervising attorney of the Tahiri Justice Center's Baltimore office. I'm going to defer to Deepa to give a little bit more of an overview about the work of the Tahiri Justice Center. I just want to note that I used to work there, and so it's wonderful to see a former colleague and to be able to dive into this issue. So I will hand it over to Deepa to explain a little bit more about the intersection of immigration and human trafficking. Just noting that Tahiri has kind of deep experience in this issue, and it's one of the primary areas that they focus on in their work. The agenda for today will be an introduction to the Tahiri Justice Center, and then Deepa will be explaining to us a little bit more about how to identify foreign-born survivors of trafficking, taking a closer look at federal trafficking laws, and providing an overview of the T visa. And I'll also note that as we're going through this presentation, we'll be trying to note instances where recent changes to state or federal laws or policies and procedures might be impacting survivors' ability to access services and justice. And I also just want to note that there is a way to ask questions if you'd like. We haven't enabled audio for participants, but there is a question box on your taskbar provided via GoToWebinar. So if you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, feel free to do that, and then we can take a moment to pause and answer it. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. It's great to see you again. As Heather introduced me, I'm the supervising attorney of Tahiri Justice's Baltimore office, where we have a small, holistic staff that represents immigrant survivors of gender-based violence in order to obtain immigration protections under U.S. law. Tahiri's mission is to protect courageous immigrant women and girls who refuse to be victims of violence by elevating their voices in communities and courts and Congress. We're creating a world where all women and girls enjoy equality and live in safety and with dignity. So I wanted to explain a little bit about how we try to achieve that mission. Since 1997, Tahiri has served over nearly 25,000 immigrant women and girls. And the core of our work is really representing those survivors of gender-based violence for immigration protection that is already embedded in U.S. law. One of the things I wanted to highlight, especially for the pro bono attorneys out there, is we have a 99% litigation success rate, and that is largely in part due to our award-winning Pro Bono Program, which is pretty unique amongst legal services providers, that we have a co-counsel model where we jointly represent our clients in obtaining this immigration relief. In addition, our public policy and training and education reinforces our direct services works in order to achieve safety and equality for our clients. So here's a little snapshot of our Pro Bono program. And I encourage people to reach out to the Tahari Justice Center, and to me in particular, if you're in the Baltimore area and you are interested in co-counseling cases with us.
And I think it's kind of a great partnership that we can have on certain cases, because, MVLS does not do immigration, but Tahari has, years of experience, and that's where their expertise lies. And, on the other hand, MVLS can help meet some of the other legal needs. And I know you refer to us pretty often for other civil legal services for clients.
Absolutely. I think, in order to achieve true justice, it really needs to take a holistic view of all the legal and non-legal needs. And it's expressly crucial when you serve survivors of human trafficking. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So the first thing I wanted to note is that there are foreign-born victims of human trafficking. I think particularly there's been a lot of focus, and rightly so, on domestic survivors of human trafficking. But there are a lot of foreign-born victims of human trafficking in the United States. And what we're really talking about are individuals who arrive from other countries, but experience the trafficking in the United States. Because we're talking about immigration relief, we're talking explicitly about those immigrants who do not have citizenship, U.S. citizenship, or legal permanent resident status. In particular, because the form of relief we're talking about is to obtain that immigration status. And the lack of immigration status, as we'll talk about, is a particular vulnerability that makes those individuals more at risk of human trafficking. So I want to say, with a caveat, we have some statistics here, but really there aren't rigorous, scientific studies on obtaining these statistics. So a lot of what we get are reports of human trafficking. And so the statistics here are mostly from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So last year in 2018, they received over 10,000 reports of human trafficking through contacts, both I think their hotline and also through the web as well. One thing I want to note is that while maybe about almost 3,000 cases where they were able to identify the immigration status of those individuals, which was only about 2,700, but half of those were foreign nationals. So individuals without U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent residence. So again, I want to emphasize half of those identified cases were for foreign nationals, which indicates a very big problem. So, and globally, and this is also very controversial, but the point of the fact is that around the world, human trafficking is a problem, and some of the estimates are that there are 20 to 40 million human trafficking victims around the world.
Just a quick note too, we did upload a copy of this PowerPoint in PDF format that you can print out later if you're interested in having the notes and having the slides. We'll also be sending out a fact sheet that condenses some of this great information that Deepa's providing.
Yes, thank you, Heather. So, while human trafficking is clearly a global problem, a national problem, it's also a problem in Maryland, in our local community. So again, these statistics I obtained from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So in 2018, they received 165 reports of human trafficking in Maryland. The majority were sex trafficking. You can see 109 of those were allegedly sex trafficking. 31 of those cases were labor. Oftentimes cases involve both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then some were not specified. But the things I wanted to highlight again were some of the venues, and we're going to talk about where you might find victims of human trafficking. But the common ones for labor: domestic work, peddling rings, restaurant, food service, hospitality. And for sex trafficking, we find that, in many places, individual homes, residence-based commercial sex, but illicit spas, hotels, escort services. So really, if you can think of any venue where there might be a kind of a service industry, you could find a victim of human trafficking. And some of, again, the demographics, and again, those are what the hotline was able to discern, and demographics they were able to get. And while the numbers are small, again, it's the proportion I think that is striking. So again, half of the individuals where they were able to obtain the immigration status, half of them were foreign nationals. And over 107 out of the 129, so do the math there, were women. And again, a majority were adults.
Another thing that I think it's important to point out with these statistics in particular is, as it skews more heavily towards reported cases of sex trafficking, that's also just a reflection of the laws and I think the awareness here in Maryland. Most of the laws in Maryland are geared towards sex trafficking. The trafficking statute until recently was located in, the prostitution subtitle. And now things are changing. And during the last General Assembly session, in Maryland in 2019, Maryland finally did pass a law explicitly against labor trafficking. Before that, we were one of only 3 states in the country that didn't have a law like that. So that's going to be going into effect October 1st. There were some other reconfigurations of the laws around trafficking in Maryland, putting things in different titles, situating them again under the crimes against person subtitle, and different shifts that were made that hopefully will help raise awareness about labor trafficking in the state, and that might lead to an increase in calls and requests for help.
I think some of that might be because identification of labor trafficking in some ways is more difficult than for victims of sex trafficking. If you think of commercial sex, right, you've got to attract a buyer. So there is that vulnerability in terms of being made aware to law enforcement and the public, right? Versus labor trafficking, oftentimes it's in plain sight. They're not necessarily trying to attract a buyer for that individual, right? It's more that labor where the public perceives it as part of normal course of business, or oftentimes domestic work in particular, which is happening oftentimes in individuals' homes. So it's not going to receive that attention from the public. It's not going to receive that same attention from law enforcement. And I think that's a large reason of why labor trafficking is harder to identify, and you're not seeing those cases as reported.
Yeah, the red flags just aren't as obvious in some of those cases. And individuals might not even realize that they are being exploited and that they can reach out for help. And we'll go into that more.
Exactly. So we've kind of touched on this already, but I want to again emphasize it with this slide. Where do you find trafficking in foreign nationals? And at Tahari, we definitely have a certain profile of cases that have happened to come to us, but we have seen victims come out of many different situations. And these are the top ones where we've had direct experience representing clients where they've suffered human trafficking. I would say the top ones I will highlight are domestic services, embassies, massage parlors, and particularly, again, I want to focus, when it says domestic services, that can both be in companies that provide domestic services, so like cleaning companies who then traffic individuals. But in a lot of our cases, it's actually happening in individual homes. And so they're really insidious. And the point of this really is that trafficking can occur anywhere.
And it's interesting because I think being here in the Baltimore, D.C. metro area, we do see some unique cases. I remember when I was at Tahrir, and I know this has continued to be a trend through the cases you've seen, just seeing people who are here on diplomatic visas, part of the embassy staff, World Bank employees. There are sometimes people that are uniquely positioned in the D.C. metro region where trafficking cases have come from. And again, there's elements of that power, of power and control that are being exerted because people have this kind of special status and are in this special location here in our country.
Right. So that's a great segue in the sense of, so not only like where I get the question of where to find trafficking victims of foreign-born nationals, where do you find them, but how do they get here? And so Heather made, one of our main profiles are individuals who may have been trafficked in their home country and are brought to the United States by those traffickers. And so a common profile, again, we see, as Heather just indicated, are by diplomats or other like World Bank employees. We've seen that a lot at Tahrir, especially coming out of that DC metro area. But there are other ways that foreign nationals come to the United States and become victims of human trafficking. So another profile commonly we see are migrants who are actually seeking asylum and who may pay for a coyote, and we'll talk about smuggling versus trafficking, but who may pay a coyote to smuggle them into the United States, but that situation becomes a trafficking situation where they're trafficked for sex or labor or both by those coyotes. Another profile we've seen actually recently more often is where Central Americans particularly are lured by a job offer by oftentimes a green card, a permanent resident or U.S. citizen, are lured by a job offer specifically trafficked, smuggled into the country by that trafficker here, and they end up in a human trafficking situation, and it was not the contract that they had made. So we're seeing that as well.
And then I think there's been a little bit in the news about some like guest worker programs and other situations where someone is kind of recruited overseas, brought here, and then, often the guest worker programs are in the news for other reasons, but it can lead sometimes to that type of exploitation and to ending up in a trafficking situation.
Right, and the distinction with what Heather just brought up, where companies or individuals are able to use the immigration system to legally get them in the country and then exert the power, and that same applies with diplomats who get a visa for those domestic workers.
Yeah, there's different modes of entry.
Definitely. In the situation I described is where green card holders and U.S. citizens are actually helping foreign nationals come in illegally. And so then they have that additional power and control over those individuals. So let's talk about power and control. So oftentimes, people they imagine human trafficking to be a situation like in a movie where people are, chained to beds and tied down. And that certainly could happen. But in my experience, traffickers use a whole toolkit of tactics in order to control their victim, in order to get them to comply with their demands for either sex or labor. And human trafficking victims oftentimes experience the same types of abuse and tactics that domestic violence victims do. So on the screen there is, you may have seen in the domestic violence context, a power and control wheel. Well, this one was specifically designed to address human trafficking, but you might notice that many of the types of abuse, such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, economic abuse, and isolation, are similar to the things you hear about when talking about domestic violence victims. And frankly, we see coercion and threats as just as of a powerful tool of abuse as, say, physical or sexual abuse, in order to intimidate and make their victims comply with the demands of their traffickers.
So what specific types of coercion and threats might foreign nationals be facing that are finding themselves in trafficking situations?
So I definitely want to talk about that, and here we are on the next slide, and I'll address that right here. It's that second prong, really, a fear of deportation. So whether the individual might be here on a dependent visa that the trafficker obtained for them and helped them get in or not, oftentimes the threat of either local police or immigration police is a very powerful threat. Oftentimes individuals don't understand there is a distinction between immigration and customs enforcement and local police. So just the threat that if they were to leave the trafficking situation and physically escape, that they would be arrested because they don't have status, or that their status is dependent on the trafficker, so that that will put them at risk of being put into jail, be prosecuted locally, but also just deported from the country. So that's a particular vulnerability that foreign-born victims face that, frankly, other victims of human trafficking don't. But here are some additional challenges. Language barrier can be a huge challenge. I always try to imagine myself, if I were in a country and I was being victimized and I didn't know couldn't read or write the language or speak the language, how would I even say the word help? Remember, these individuals are being, completely controlled and often do not have access to a phone, or even if they do, it's highly controlled and monitored.
You might not even know to call 911, right, or what, how those ways to reach out for help that we really often take for granted.
Exactly. That is also very common, that people don't know how to even ask for help. So lack of familiarity with the geography and available social and legal services. Again, going back to Heather's point of the 911, like something, again, it's just so basic to us and natural, but someone who's from another country where they don't have that system wouldn't know. But I've seen this time and time again, whether I often have clients who are not literate even in their own language, let alone English, and English might be a language they don't know at all, or might be a third or second language, but where they couldn't tell me the name of the street where they lived on for 10 years when they were being trafficked by a family in their individual home. So they couldn't tell me the name of the street or the county or the city where they were being trafficked, which can make it very difficult. Also, one fear in particular that foreign-born victims face is that traffickers often have connections or traffic them from their home country. So they know exactly where the client's home is in that foreign country. They know how to contact and get to their relatives. So we see that as a common threat, that if you were to escape or you were to report what was going on, we're going to harm your children, your spouse, your parents. And so that is a very effective tool of control and abuse that traffickers use to make their victims comply. The other ones I'll briefly touch on, the lack of support network in the United States. Again, so oftentimes clients say, well, I had freedom of movement, but where was I going to go? Not only was I scared, they threatened to call the police, and I was scared of being arrested. And to note, fear of police can be very powerful because oftentimes our clients may have been tortured in their home country by government police. I have a fear of experiences back home that makes them very fearful of reaching out to law enforcement. But having this lack of support network is a very disabling type of fear, where clients oftentimes, even sometimes, bond with their traffickers because that's who's providing them with their basic needs. And by escaping, they are putting themselves at risk. And we see this as a real consequence of being homeless, not having food to eat, and then obviously all the other kind of vulnerabilities when that situation arises. Also, lack of identity documents. That's one of the things you need just to get by in this world, to get public benefits, to access social services, to get access into buildings and even public transportation sometimes. So not only either maybe they never had identity documents before they were trafficked, but oftentimes the trafficker physically is in possession of those identity documents. And victims don't have the time if they have an opportunity to escape to retrieve those documents back. Mm-hmm. And then finally, but almost one of probably the most important factors is trauma. Both if they're currently in the situation and they're experiencing active abuse, coercion, and threats, but even where clients have been able to physically escape the situation, often the trauma that the abuse they've suffered disables them in order of accessing benefits and safety and reporting as well. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge issue.
Well, as I think of, working with domestic survivors of trafficking and individuals that don't have that immigration component mm-hmm. to be concerned about, the list is very similar. There's, but here there's more, and it's almost like ratcheted up a level. Every single characteristic or thing that a trafficker might do to exploit a person mm-hmm. and to isolate a person right. just gets amplified when you have that underlying issue of lack of stable status.
Exactly. And that's what I talk a lot about when I'm talking about immigration and domestic violence, right? They're experiencing a lot of the same tools of abuse and type of abuse that non-foreign born victims face, but it is under this extra layer mm-hmm. and extra prism of potential for abuse because of their vulnerable immigration status. That is oftentimes the most powerful force in keeping them in the situation. So I want to read through this case example, and we're not going to, tackle like a law school exam case hypo, but it's first of all, to give you kind of a snapshot of a classic example that we've seen at Tahrir in terms of a victim of human trafficking. But in talking about the subsequent issues, namely identifying human trafficking victims, what to do when confronted with the victim, yet not in a safe place, and whether or not the victim might qualify immigration protections, that you're keeping this scenario in mind as we talk through some of that. So Fatoumata came to the United States from Mali on a tourist visa and remained in Maryland after her visa expired. She was working on jobs in order to support herself and send money to her mother in Mali when she met and started dating Usman, a fellow Malian. Usman ran a small construction company and offered her a steady and well-paid job with his business with the condition that she move in with him. Feeling like she had no choice, she agreed. Once she moved in, Usman took her passport and cell phone and told her that in addition to working for his company, she would have to cook, clean the house, do his laundry, and that he would not pay her because those tasks were her duty as his partner. Usman would regularly rape her and threaten to harm her mother and Molly if she did not comply with his demands or if she called the police. Fatimata is still living with Usman. She recently was injured when he beat her yesterday, and she is now in your office. What challenges does Fatimata face? What would you do next? I know that was a long hypo, but it has it's chock full of different factors, and this is again a classic fact pattern where this is straight out of my own cases. So one of the first things I think it's important to understand when working with foreign-born victims of human trafficking is you cannot isolate their legal needs from their other needs. You really need to view it in terms of case assessment as a holistic case assessment, and I've bolded and made bigger the word safety. Because if your clients are not in a safe and stable place, they cannot participate in their legal case. They cannot comply with the things that you need them to in order to make them eligible, perhaps for a T visa. And we'll talk about those requirements, what those are. But if their basic needs are not being met, and if their safety is not secured, it's impossible really to move forward on any legal cases. So safety is just one of those things. Other things you may have not thought about is, collaboration with social service providers, coordination with law enforcement. As we indicated in the previous slide, trauma is a major issue for survivors of human trafficking. So referrals to mental health services, cultural linguistic barriers that need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. So it's just a plethora of needs. And one of the things I want to point out is, again, as many of you are attorneys, hopefully listening in on this, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed because there are a lot of resources out there. And one of the things at Tahare is we have a holistic legal and social services approach to our legal cases. So we have social services on staff. So even if you're not working with a nonprofit that has that model, there are service providers out there that you could work even as a private pro bono in order to meet those needs.
And that's something we try to do here too at MVLS with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project model. I think that's what makes this particular program unique amongst some of the programs at MVLS, because there is more of a case management approach to handling clients. And that means that we're ready with support and referrals. And, I have a background in crisis management and case management, as you know, from my former work with the Forced Marriage Initiative, to really try and look holistically at all the things that a person needs to move forward with their life and safety. And as you stated, to be ready to deal with the pressures of moving forward with a legal case. When we work on vacature here, those are also, extremely involved. Petitions that we have to prepare with the client. We have to go deep into their story. We have to be sure that they have the mental health and other supports to have, stable housing, and that they're in a place where they're ready to dive into that kind of work together with an attorney. So.
Absolutely. So we're going to now shift to talking about how do you identify a victim of human trafficking. And, oftentimes when a client comes to you, they've already been identified as a victim of human trafficking, and they're being referred by maybe what I call a first responder. So that could be social services agency, it could be law enforcement, it could be someone in healthcare. But sometimes, especially if you're at a legal services organization and you're getting just a call from a service seeker, it's really important that you are able to identify a victim of human trafficking, and if they're foreign-born, whether they might be eligible for the T visa. So I'm not going to go through each and every point on the next following slides, but highlighting these as red flags.
It's a good list. It's a comprehensive list that you can reference in the future.
Definitely. So, things like demonstrating, if you meet with them in person, fearful or nervous behavior, say if they're coming with another person, unwilling or hesitant to answer questions about injury or illness. Some of this might be applied to more first responders, but I think even on legal screenings, in person or sometimes over the phone, you want to ask these questions. Are they in possession of their identity documents? And if not, who is in control of that? Do they have any money? Or are their wages being held by somebody else? For minors, they're school age but not going to school. That's a big red flag for minor, both labor and sex trafficking. So these are just some red flags that you should be aware of. Keep that in the back of your mind. The next slides are more specifically red flags in connection with the specific types of trafficking. So, sometimes it's really hard to try to distinguish between what's labor exploitation, wage and hour exploitation, and trafficking. And we'll talk about the key components when we talk about the T visa. But here are some red flags for individuals who may be labor trafficked: that they've been abused at work or threatened with harm by an employer. They're not allowed to take adequate breaks, food, water at work. They're not provided with adequate, protective equipment. They were recruited for some different work than what they're actually doing. They're promised one thing, but in reality, they're doing something else. They're required to live in housing provided by the employer, or they have a debt to the employer that they can't seem to pay off no matter how long they've worked. And the next are just a couple of indicators of sex trafficking. I don't, we don't need to go in through all of them, but some of the things to think about, I think, unusually high numbers of sexual partners, and there are other kind of red flags that I don't think we need to go through them today.
And if you're interested in learning more, diving deeper into some of these identifying factors, there is our Human Trafficking 101 that we have available on the MVLS website too.
So now I want to shift attention to immigration protections for foreign-born victims of human trafficking. And so this slide just highlights, we're going to talk about the T visa exclusively today, but human trafficking victims who are foreign-born also are eligible for the U visa. Also, it's called non-immigrant status, but colloquially we call it the U visa. And they're for victims of certain crimes, including human trafficking. But I also want to note that victims of human trafficking might be eligible for other civil forms of relief. Also, if there were even wage and hour violations, they could get their right to their compensation that was unpaid or paid below, minimum requirements. So know that there are other forms of relief for them as well. But we're going to talk about the T visa today. So the T visa was created as part of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. The most important thing to know about this is that, trafficking was determined to be a global problem. And there was something called the Palermo Protocol. And so the TVPRA, or the TVPA, was created to try to implement that. And the goals of the TVPRA or TVPA are to protect victims of human trafficking, to prosecute traffickers, and to prevent human trafficking. So those are like the three prongs. And the T visa was created as a form of immigration protection for victims of human trafficking.
And in that last slide, I just think it's really important to note that it did create this level of protection where foreign-born survivors of trafficking are entitled to those benefits the same as refugees are. And that you'll talk about more, but it's amazing how, it really was forward-thinking in trying to carve out a good scope of protection and support for survivors.
Right. We're definitely going to talk about some of the unique benefits of the T visa for human trafficking victims that are unique to that and are not available, frankly, for other forms of relief. So in order to be eligible for T non-immigrant status, or otherwise known as a T visa, an applicant is or has been a victim of a severe form of trafficking, including attempted trafficking, is physically present in the United States on account of trafficking, has complied with any reasonable request for assistance in the investigation or prosecution if they're over the age of 18. They would suffer extreme hardship involving unusual and severe harm if removed from the United States. So we're going to talk a little bit about each prong. So before we break down each prong, I want to highlight some of the unique characteristics of the T visa. So the T visa is one of those special forms of relief adjudicated by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service that really have been given, the attention that is required in order to adjudicate these humanitarian forms of relief. Both Congress and immigration has recognized, because the basis of relief is based on victimization, that they needed a specialized unit with officers who are trained to understand the dynamics of human trafficking. The Vermont Service Center is that specialized unit, so it's important to understand it's the same unit that adjudicates the U visa for victims of crimes and protections under the Violence Against Women's Act for victims of domestic and family violence. So it is this really, it's different than any other area of immigration. So traditionally have gotten very good results from that service center because they've got special training. I will talk about some policy changes that have impacted that. But also know that just like cases under the Violence Against Women's Act, the T visa also has strong confidentiality provisions. For example, they cannot make an adverse decision against an applicant from information solely obtained by a perpetrator of human trafficking. The third point I wanted to make is historically there's been a minimal risk of referral to immigration court if the underlying application is denied. That has changed. USCIS in the last year has created and implemented a new policy that explicitly states that individuals whose applications are denied and they have no other form of immigration status will be given a notice to appear in immigration court and removal proceedings will be initiated. That is a huge change of policy. And we were hoping for a long time that this specialized unit, what we call the humanitarian unit at the Vermont Service Center, that policy would not apply to them. But then in the last couple of months, they clarified that yes, that what we call the NTA policy does apply. So that now that we are concerned that will be cause a chilling effect for victims to report and apply for these benefits that they're entitled to under U.S. law. So that is a great concern to us.
I know in the most recent TIP report that was issued by the Department of State, advocates who contribute to the report highlighted that chilling effect, and I know it's continuing to be of major concern to advocates working on this issue.
Right. But overall, in terms of immigration, both relief available and who the adjudicator is. Still, I would say that these specific forms of humanitarian relief, the T visa, the use of VAWA, compared to other forms of relief, tend still to be more victim-centric in terms of the officers who decide this, make those decisions, than say other areas like you've heard in the news a lot about asylum, where I think we're still trying to hold steady with making sure that the officers understand the special, unique nature of the victimization and that they're applying the rules and the laws justly and with empathy. But that is becoming more difficult, so I'll be frank about that. So another thing, the last prong on that, and I'm skipping to this slide, is that these type of cases have a different evidence standard than other forms of immigration relief. The burden of proof is preponderance, but the standard of evidence is any credible evidence. This is actually a very specific policy decision that Congress made because it's understanding that survivors of domestic and sexual violence and trauma survivors and victims of human trafficking might not have access to traditional sources of primary evidence. So they created this specific standard of evidence that allows victims, domestic violence, and human trafficking survivors more easily able to substantiate their claims. Okay. So one key thing to understand is that the definition of trafficking is very specific in the federal code. And in order to be eligible for the T visa, they must meet this definition. So for sex trafficking, it's, commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, unless the person's under the age of 18. Then you don't need that force, fraud, or coercion element. And for labor trafficking, it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Well, that's a mouthful. And when you do a T visa, and if you've never done one before, either, my recommendation is do it with, co-counsel with an organization that does these as their area of expertise, like Tahare or another nonprofit. Or you can also get technical assistance oftentimes from those organizations. But breaking this down is important. We're not going to go into the nitty gritty of it, but I'm going to highlight the two that, that I think you need to pay most attention to, and whether, in terms of whether the type of activity is trafficking under the federal definition in order to get the T visa. So the two we see most commonly at Tahare is debt bondage. And here's the definition there. I'm not going to read it out loud, but, focusing on debt bondage. And we see that a lot, particularly in cases where the trafficker smuggled in the victim. And so they'll say, okay, well, I paid $5,000 for you to get here. You have to work for me doing XYZ until you pay back that debt, and you can't leave and you can't be free to leave, or you must do this work or service until you pay back that debt. But in reality, that debt, is never defined. It seems like it's never able to be paid back. And so really, it's debt bondage. The other form of human trafficking we see is involuntary servitude. So really, that this person believes that they would suffer serious harm or physical restraint if they didn't comply with that activity. We often, while yes, physical and sexual assaults can occur in order to make them comply, we often see the abuse or threat of abuse of the legal process. So for example, I'm going to call the police and they're going to deport you, which we know, again, it's a confusing nuance of what's immigration police and local police, but that threat oftentimes is enough to make them comply to do work against their will. So, I get that, people often are confused or struggle with distinguishing what makes something human trafficking and what makes something, work labor violations. And really, it's that free will and the willingness. And so the key elements is that labor or the sex work obtained through force, fraud, or coercion, right? And so you really want to look at what is making them stay. Do they feel like they have the freedom to really stop doing that work or to leave the situation? If the answer is no, you're probably looking at human trafficking. Versus if, they could leave, but they just had they felt like because they needed to take money and they couldn't find another job, but they could have left really at any time, that they might not be in a trafficking situation. They might have remedies under, other types of laws, but it's not really human trafficking. So the key is really understanding the force, fraud, and coercion elements.
And this is so similar to, what we do here at the HTPP when Jessica and I talk about, it's the same definition of force, fraud, and coercion, but having that wider lens when you're working with a foreign-born client and thinking, and I think of kind of more nuanced and wider ranging situations that might not make someone feel threatened if they have stable status here, but when you don't have that stable status, it can really, create a lot of fear and a lot of intimidation.
So the coercive elements that I highlight, again, are threats of harm to the victim's family and home country that trafficker might have access to. The threat to call immigration and have someone deported or revoke their dependent visa. So again, there's additional tools of abuse that a trafficker has against a foreign-born victim that they may not have for someone who's not in that situation. So I wanted to touch briefly on trafficking versus smuggling, because often, especially in the media, you're hearing, sometimes you have people who say that, well, that's just smuggling. That's not really trafficking. They're conflating what the two are. And the thing is, though, in reality, what I see a lot of times is smuggling that truly turns into human trafficking. And some of the key differences between trafficking and smuggling, and again, I wanted to highlight this because that's just a lot of the cases I'm seeing, is that smuggling is typically voluntary and lacks coercion. There is this perception of smuggled persons as criminals and violating the law, versus trafficked persons as victims. And one of the key factors, oftentimes people think trafficking, I think the word traffic, that it requires this going across the border. And that's not true. You could have come here like in our hypo, which came here legally, but then ended up in a human trafficking situation. So whereas smuggling really is about, crossing of that border. And again, but the key is, I would say, is the voluntariness of it. So the next elements that I want to run through, we have about almost 18 minutes left, and we want to make sure there's time to address any questions if anyone has any. But the next element is that part of this is, and it goes back to the nature of the TVPRA of prosecuting traffickers, is a requirement to assist law enforcement and report the trafficking to local and state law enforcement. And so we've listed, using acronyms, some of the law enforcement agencies: Department of Justice, the FBI, ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, DOL is the Department of Labor. So those are agencies where, as part of the trafficking, the T visa, generally you are required to report and cooperate with law enforcement.
Clients that you see, Deepa, have they usually reported by the time they reach your office, or do you assist with helping them report to an agency?
The vast majority of the clients have not reported. So it's one of the key things we do as lawyers is to help them report. And one of the reason why especially it's important is that we want to make sure we do that safely. We don't want to expose them and get them in removal proceedings if they're not already in removal proceedings, because sometimes the law enforcement agency, depending what it is, will jump to removal proceedings. And we want to make sure we know, so building relationships and making sure we know the best ways to safely report in order to make them eligible for the T is very crucial in this, because we don't want to further expose our clients to more trauma and potential removal.
Especially with I feel like ever shifting ground
exactly.
right now.
Exactly. So other key factors of this element is the success of the investigation or prosecution does not affect eligibility. So I'll tell you, the majority of my cases, no one is ever prosecuted. Sometimes our client is never even interviewed. We make a report by email or by phone. Sometimes they're interviews, but still, again, it doesn't lead to a prosecution. I think they're notoriously difficult. And oftentimes law enforcement is not interested unless there's multiple victims. And the big fish is more than just, say, an individual person who trafficked. And again, like I've said at Tahari, oftentimes they might be a family who's trafficked someone for domestic work. Unlike other types of relief, like for example, the U visa, the good news with the T visa is a law enforcement certification, while helpful, is not required. So oftentimes I can't get a certification from law enforcement, but it doesn't prevent us from applying and being successful in obtaining the T visa. Another thing to note is if your client is under 18, they do not have to assess with law enforcement in order to be eligible. And then there's one other exception, which is if your client is unable to cooperate due to physical and psychological trauma, they're exempt from this requirement. But it's something you need to establish, which is in the next slide. In 2 slides from now I'll address. But here are some helpful tips on how to document efforts to assist. And again, this goes back to that any credible evidence standard. But here are some examples of how to show that your client was helpful. I do want to, again, this slide highlights the trauma exception, because I think sometimes we think, okay, clients doesn't want to, for many reasons, to report to law enforcement, and this case is too difficult. And I've even seen, other nonprofits have done this work who really sometimes pressure their clients to say, really, in order to be successful, you have to report. But where you could be successful in that trauma exemption argument, you should try it, because we have been successful at Tahare. So you do need to show that the client is unable to comply or cooperate, or you can argue that they would be risk at suffering future trauma or re-traumatization, or it's unreasonable for them to comply or cooperate. One of the strategies I've used is to use independent psychological evaluations, especially when client has said to you, if I report, they've expressed suicidal ideation and explained why. And we've been successful in meeting this trauma exception. So I think you need to think outside of that traditional box of that we have to report. This element of being physically present on account of trafficking has become very difficult, and we're seeing a trend of denials from USCIS on this prong. It used to be pretty not too difficult to establish, but particularly in cases where they've left the trafficking situation years ago. I've had clients who left the trafficking situation 10 years ago, and we've been successful. But the key is that you need to show that they are here today on account of the trafficking that may have occurred a year ago or 2 years ago. And so we're seeing a lot of denials and we, frankly, didn't see that many T visa denials because there weren't a lot of people applying for it, and immigration seemed to be very generous in granting these applications. We're seeing denials, particularly on this prong, saying you haven't shown why your client today is here physically present on account of the trafficking that occurred several years ago. So it's really important that you adequately explain that through evidence, through your client's declaration of why they're physically present here today.
And does that go back to some of the factors you were talking about earlier, like again, the trafficker having connections and knowledge of what's going on in, say, the survivor's home country,
Exactly.
and that it might not be safe for them to go back, or there might be threats ongoing because they've left a trafficking situation and are now trying to get some form of relief and help. So
exactly. And then, then it might be something, relating to trauma, where the experience happened 10 years ago. Some people would say, well, okay, 10 years ago, you're still traumatized. Well, yes, depending on the types of abuse they suffered. Yes, it's that trauma still having residual effects today that has made them present. And you can focus on a lot of things, such as like if they're still receiving therapy based on the abuse they suffered. I have, there are cases where they might have children in common with their trafficker if they were, if they were sexually abused, or it was sex work and they ended up becoming pregnant, and that can be a factor as well. There are a lot of different ways, and the key is each case is unique, and you take the facts in your client's specific case and you make the argument.
So you got to connect with a great organization like Tahir to get all the nuances, right?
Right. And so, and Heather, you just indicated, about where a trafficker could harm people back home or could harm them if they return. And so that I want to point that out, because that goes to the next element, extreme hardship factors. So that's exactly the types of factors we look at. Like, well, if they were, so this last prong is if they were to return to their home country, they would suffer extreme hardship. Well, they might be re-trafficked again, or this trafficker has connections and could harm them. Access to mental health or medical services in their home country might not be available. So there is a list, a bigger list of like traditional extreme hardship factors. Country conditions I've used as well. What's going on in home country. So all these things you want to show would make it not just difficult for them, but they would actually suffer extreme hardship. Mere economic harm or lack of opportunity alone probably won't get you there. So those are all the requirements under the T visa. But in addition to meeting those requirements, your client also have to be admissible. So inadmissibility or admissibility has to basically be that you haven't had certain behaviors or done certain things that would make you ineligible for that immigration benefit. And so some of the inadmissibilities that I highlight here, the person might have a criminal history that may or may not be connected to the trafficking. Engaging in prostitution. So obviously if they've done commercial sex work, they've engaged in prostitution. Misrepresentation to federal immigration authorities in the past, entering U.S. without inspection. These are very common grounds of inadmissibility. And so in order to obtain the T visa, you either have to be admissible, so don't have these problems, or obtain a waiver. And you can do that by applying for a waiver.
Just a quick note on the last slide. It's interesting, again, thinking of the intersection between MVLS and Tahir with, our focus on trying to help people with criminal record relief and address prostitution convictions through the vacatur process when someone is a survivor of trafficking. That's where I think it's really important for us to be able to consult with each other and, make sure that there's no unforeseen complications that might happen by trying to provide things like criminal record relief. I know, of course, you've advised me in the past with clients to keep, really be sure you're keeping copies of all the records, like, because, you don't want suddenly official records to not match what's in certain databases. And so this is, again, where it's great to have this kind of collaborative relationships to really ensure we're doing kind of holistic support and looking at all the legal angles for trafficking survivors that don't have stable status.
Like one common example is expungement. Well, in the domestic context where someone is not a foreign-born, getting expungement is great. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that for foreign-born victims, but you need to get certified copies of everything, because the way immigration works is they don't just get at questions like, have you ever been convicted? And so if you've had vacatur or expungement, you could say you don't have a record in some context. But immigration wants to get at the behavior. So if you've committed certain acts, they'll ask you about the acts, and you need to provide documentation. And oftentimes, if you've gotten those records expunged, you're in a difficult situation because it's your burden to prove. So it's really important to collaborate with other service providers.
And it'd be interesting too to think about like how maybe a granted motion to vacate a prostitution conviction could be an important potential piece of evidence, maybe in a TV petition.
Right.
So there's again lots of ways that these things can support, getting legal relief in different contexts.
Exactly. And so going back to the waiver, there's a way to ask for a waiver of some of these grounds of inadmissibility. And some of them, some of the grounds need to be connected, or some of the bases where if they're connected to trafficking, we're generally a lot more confident in obtaining the waiver. When they're not connected, there might be a different legal basis and it might be more difficult, but that's something really to, discuss with an experienced immigration attorney, and the risks and benefits of, going forward on a T visa case with inadmissibilities. One thing I want to note, the fee waiver, there are fee waivers, but one of the other big issues that is occurring is that this specialized unit that traditionally has been really sensitive towards victims and very generous for fee waivers, we're seeing denials across the board for even these victim-based, and can be very devastating, because while there are no fees generally for the underlying petition, like the U visa, the T visa, for these waivers, which are necessary in order to obtain the benefit, there are fees. And so I want to make a correction. At the time this slide was crafted, it was $545. Now it's, I believe it's $930. So that would be for
huge amount of money.
and if you have eligible family members who also need to file waivers, that's $930 for each individual.
Oh my
So
goodness.
that can be difficult. I want to race through. We only have 5 more minutes, but I just want to note the benefits of the T visa. I mean, they're huge for your clients. They get 4 years of legal status and the ability to work legally. They get the same public benefits as a refugee, and actually even during the application process, they can be eligible for benefits under the TVAP. So there can be a lot of financial benefits in order to make them stable that's provided for them. They can petition for eligible family members, as is listed on that slide, and I'm not going to go into all of them. But I always say keep your eye on the prize. The biggest prize is the ability to apply for lawful permanent residency, because the T visa is a non-immigrant status and it is limited for 4 years. So after the 4 years is up, there's no way to renew the T visa. But what you can do is apply for lawful permanent resident status. And so that's really what the goal is for most of our clients. I'm going to skip the continued presence slide. That's just a temporary immigration relief while this whole process is going on, but it can provide for some protection. But that's usually mostly used when the survivor only wishes to remain here for a brief period of time, but wants to maybe return back to their country. And as I indicated, the adjustment of status, again, that's the big prize out there, is really getting this permanent status in order to be here in this country.
And just this list, though, reflects there are additional requirements that a person will then have to meet to be able. So you've got to go through all the requirements for the T visa, all the requirements for a potential waiver of inadmissibility, and then further down the road, usually is it about 3 years down the road?
Usually 3 years, unless, there's this exception if the investigation is closed and you can get a letter from the Department of Justice or agency that the investigation is closed. You can apply for it as quickly as 1 year after obtaining the T, but generally it's 3 years.
So, but then you have this additional number of things that requirements you have to meet. And I think I just want to emphasize this to point out too, this isn't an easy process.
Right.
Like, this is something that takes a lot of dedication on behalf of attorneys, dedication on behalf of the survivor, to apply for. But, there are experts out there that can guide you through this.
Right.
And again, accessing technical assistance, accessing, a pro bono program to provide this kind of help, I think is really critical, particularly given some of the things that you've mentioned have been happening over the last few years to make this more challenging.
Right. And I think Heather's point is great, because these individuals are vetted. So a lot of, we hear a lot of fears about who are we granting this benefit for. So not only have they been, they're survivors of human trafficking, as part of the process, they have to have a criminal background check. And if there are any inadmissibilities, they have to get a waiver, which is not necessarily easy to do, especially if it's not related to the trafficking. So, we're not just, immigration is very vigorous and really fully investigating these individuals and granting relief and this benefit for those who meet the requirements. So that's all for me today. But I know that Heather has, there's just some local resources there that I think everyone should be aware of. And just, again, it underscores the holistic attitude you have need to have in order to serve these clients.
And, I think both Tahari and MVLS's Human Trafficking Prevention Program are really well connected here, throughout Maryland and for you guys in the greater DC, Baltimore area, to be sure that, whether it's in-house or through referrals or, community partnerships, we're ensuring that anyone that doesn't have status and that is a trafficking survivor can really get that holistic case management and care that they need to be able to pursue some of these legal remedies.
Exactly.
So thank you so
much,
Deepa. That was really a great conversation, and I hope everyone that listened in was able to get a more thorough understanding of not just the challenges that individuals face when they don't have stable status here and they are survivors of trafficking, but also how to help screen for such individuals, connect them with services and remedies that are available to help them, again, move forward with their lives in safety and have stability here in the United States. So you can see Deepa's contact information. I'm sure she won't mind if you reach out with any further questions. I didn't see any questions pop up on my go-to webinar control panel. So, again, you can feel free to reach out to either of us if you'd like to follow up. We will be, per usual, sending out a post-webinar survey, so please do tell us what you think. And this is also a chance, as this is a quarterly webinar series hosted by the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, if there are additional topics that you would love a deeper dive into and to see how they relate to human trafficking, we would love to hear your feedback and suggestions. I also just want to encourage you to follow MVLS on social media. You can see, our Facebook and other social media links. And you can also always come and visit our website to find out more about upcoming trainings and clinics. We also have pro bono cases always listed on our pro bono portal. And you can go there to, again, find ways to get involved and to help individuals in need of free legal services here in Maryland. Here's a quick list of some upcoming trainings and volunteer opportunities. Just a quick note, we'll be talking about tomorrow at noon, changes in Maryland law that happened this year that are coming out of the last General Assembly session. We'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are related to human trafficking. There were a number of pieces of legislation that got passed during the 2019 session, and we'll talk about some of our priorities for next year, not just in the realm of human trafficking, but across the board, looking at criminal record relief, looking at developments in family law, consumer protection, and other areas that MVLS covers. For now, though, I'm just going to say again, a huge thank you. That was so informative. Please feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any questions, considering taking cases from both our organizations because there is a lot of need out there right now for help. And we'll hope to see you next time. Thank you.